Hey everybody, this is my first Facebook Live video, so I'm just gonna wait for different people to come on because it's now 1 o'clock, and I'm really excited about my topic today. I hope that people are able to find me, and yeah, I'm just really excited. This is my first Facebook Live. Who knew? So I'm going to go ahead and get started because there's a lot of information to cover. But basically at the beginning of this month, I, along with some other people at Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, hosted a gathering of different multicultural worship leaders from all around the country and one from Canada. And we were talking about sort of the past of the past, how we got to this point of multicultural worship, what that means to us today, and what we imagine for the future. Hey Gloria, how are you? It's so good to see you on here. I thought you weren't going to make it, but you did, so thank you. So at any point you can ask questions. I will try really hard to get to it, but I will be speeding through as much as I can because I know that everybody's busy. It's the holidays. So these are people from all over the nation, one from Canada. Some of these people were academics. We had thought leaders, we had a host of practitioners from all over the states doing really cool, imaginative, really innovative things around worship. And so we shared with each other. We just sat, we sat in a room for 2 days, and we just were talking and fleshing out, what is this thing called multicultural worship? What do we imagine for the future? And I really wanted to put this together because my friend Adam and I, we talk about this all the time. He is a doctoral student. I am a regular student and a practitioner. And we thought it might be really cool to get thought leaders together to talk about this. And I really care just in general about the church. I care about where it's going, where it's headed, where we're all going. And so, yeah. So a little bit about who was actually in the room. We had people from Urbana, the InterVarsity Missions Conference, which is where I got introduced to the whole concept of multicultural worship. We had people from Arrabon and Urban Doxology there. We had people from the Christian Community Development Association, CCDA. Proskuneo, of course, was there. The International Council of Ethnodoxologists. A lot of people don't even know that field of study exists. Then you had 2/3 of the Truth Table podcast, which is like church to a lot of people. Really great podcast. We had the Praise Hands podcast, Black Christian Influencers, Tiffany Hines, the United Methodist Church, Duke, Calvin, and Fuller were all involved, and there were a number of different sorts of churches, all denominations. We didn't have a lot of Catholics there, but we had megachurch, non-denominational represented as well, and the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network. So all in all, there were about over 40 of us that were in that room trying to talk, and here are the 10 things that I have learned. The first takeaway is that really worship is not done in a vacuum. The first night we made a timeline of events that happen around the world, in our nation, in our lives, in our society, and in the world of music. We put together this huge timeline. There are over 40 people contributing to this timeline. And we found that there were significant things in the world that happened, significant changes that led to the change in the development of worship music itself. So one example is 9/11. So after 9/11, there was this air of suspicion of the other, suspicion of foreigners, just this general sense of fear amongst people that you don't know. So there's this otherizing that went on. Another major thing was the use of technology and globalization to bring about globalization. You could now go into any country and any society and see things happening in real live time. You could see things happening like bombings or shootings. You could see police interactions. You can see a lot more things going on in the world, and you could also see things going on musically. So that really changed the face of worship. Another major event is that, Christian contemporary worship music existed sort of on its own, independent record label, just sort of mixtaping it up, and then it got bought out because it was an unsustainable thing. It got bought out by major record label companies like Atlantic Records or BMI. And so because of that, all the music, it just changed. The worship music changed immediately. The sound, the production value, all of that, marketing, all about making dollars and aggressive marketing campaigns to try and get the dollars of Christians into the pockets of these record labels really changed the sound of worship. So all of this really influenced things. Okay. The second thing that I took away from this is the fact that, and I have known this before, but it was really cemented by talking with other people, that our worship is racialized. So Julie Tai, who is the chapel director at Fuller Seminary, she really did a great job sort of unpacking this during her TED Talk sort of style thing. She reminded us that, as a Korean American worship leader, which I am too, so I completely relate to her and I understand what she's going through, she was really pressurized to define all Asian worship. Like, is it a sound? What sound is it? What are the instruments? What are the languages? And it's really hard to sort of do that because Asians are not in a monolith. Asia is a really big country, and on top of that, we were born and raised in America, and so to really, it just really complicates that conversation. And in a lot of multicultural music presentations, you have you've got your black music, which is gospel, you've got your white music, which is CCM, and anything that isn't black or white is basically multicultural. And so you have these categories, and in the presentation, it's just a very racialized form of worship. And yeah, so she really brought that up. The third, that goes along with my third point, the big takeaway, is that tokenism is no longer going to work. We need to think about sustainable ways of incorporating people of color in worship. The best person who brought this point up, was Dr. Gerardo Marti, who is a sociologist at Davidson College, and he wrote a book called Worship Across the Racial Divide. And we hosted him for book panels. I got to interview him. It was so great. And he was talking about, his studies found that if a black person walked into a white church, the white church would immediately get that person to join the worship team because there's a stereotype that they were good at music, regardless if they were good at music or not. So they would be recruited to join the band or the choir or start a gospel choir even. And so because of that, in this really weird way, that person gets incorporated into the community, but sort of through this kind of racist profile, stereotyping sort of situation that went on. And I have been a part of so many churches and organizations where they see that revelation vision. They want all kingdoms, tribes, nations, tongues to be worshiping around Jesus, the Lamb on the throne. And usually their first sort of tactic of doing that is to diversify the music. And so they hire that one person of color to become all things. And Gerardo Marti calls it sort of this racialized sort of role, that they are expected to be the racial change agents. And how that's really unfair. It's an injustice towards the worship leader. And I think in the coming years, I think a lot of worship leaders, because there's so many instances of this happening, they get pressured. And so there's going to be sort of a great awakening of a lot of these people of color that they have been tokenized, that there's this pressure on them to really perform their racial or ethnic identity. And this sort of pressure is not, it's not fair, and it's not sustainable. And it doesn't really lead to a lot of change. That's another point that Dr. Marti was saying, was it doesn't really lead to any sort of racial change. All it does is it incorporates that person into the band or the music team, and sometimes they stay and sometimes they don't, right? So it doesn't really change a lot. So we need to rethink what what multicultural worship practice really is. Hey, Sue-Ann, thanks for staying up late for me, girl. Okay, the fourth point is that we really need to focus on creating. The best person who brought this up was David Bailey, who is a longtime friend of mine. We used to lead worship at a lot of different places, a lot of different conferences and events. Too many, like big and small. And he, in the past few years, have changed from multicultural or diverse worship to culture making. So because of this, he created a songwriting internship, and out of this songwriting internship, which focuses on the urban context, was born the group Urban Doxology, which many of us have heard of. They produce really, really great music, at least 2 albums, and then they've collaborated on several other projects with other worship artists. And I think this is sort of his way of injecting sort of a different narrative, a different Christian way of worship, which is so good. You know, Willie Jennings talks a lot about having cleansing images of Christ all around us, and that is the work that David Bailey is really trying to do up there in Richmond, because I'm down here in North Carolina. But up there in Richmond, he's working on just working on bringing about culture change and culture making, and this is sort of the sort of our next steps. You know, it doesn't matter if you're signed on to a big record label or not. Create. And in a lot of ways, churches sort of kill a worship leader's creativity because you have that weekly deadline. I've been there. I know. Every Sunday, you got to prepare. You got to get your volunteers ready. You got to get your musicians lined up. You got to have your arrangements and your click track in line, and you got to have your backing tracks. And it's so easy to just reach for the most convenient thing that comes in a package with all of that. You know, you can just buy it nowadays, and it's really convenient because you don't have time to foster or cultivate creativity amongst your own worship team to write songs and to do their own arrangements. And so creativity, I think, is going to be is going to play a huge role in multicultural or diverse worship in the future. The fifth point, we need more authors and academics to write about this. We did a survey of everybody that was there. Give your top 3 resources that have been helpful to you to think about multicultural worship. And there were like 4 people that recommended one book, which is Sandra Van Opsel's book, The Next Worship. But everybody else had like their one book. You know, there wasn't this like sort of all around sort of like this is the definitive book for worship or for diversity in worship. It was just all over the map. Everybody had their own resources. And when we did our book panel, we realized that all of the book panel authors were male. So that's one thing, except for Sandra, who wasn't there. She's the only female in this whole equation. And then on our academic panel, the people that wrote specifically about worship were white male. And so we need more people, we need more worship leaders to publish, to share about what they're doing, to share about best practices. We need more content. And I think in the coming years, as times change and as more churches want to have this sort of multicultural vision, we're going to see a lot more content out there. Actually, there was one person there, her name is Tamisha Tyler, and I know her because all my friends were taking selfies with her. I had no idea who she was, but she kept popping up on my social media feed, and then I finally got to have my own selfie with her. So, but Tamisha Tyler is a doctoral student at Fuller, and she created, or was a part of a group that created a whole new field of study called theopoetics, which is related to theology and the arts. It's very, very exciting. I mean, it's just an exciting time for all of us. I'm just really excited. But she is creating that, and they're having their first annual conference this year in 2020. I think in March it is, in Chicago. And so she's sort of creating this sort of content. Okay, number 6, and this is really, really important. We need to understand what it means to decolonize our faith and how to live and worship in a post-colonial world. Right now, there's a lot of talk about deconstructing somebody's faith. There's a lot of talk about decolonizing. I don't think we have fully grasped what that is, and I'm really excited for next semester because I'm actually taking a class taught by the person who actually created the term decoloniality. I'm so excited, Walter Menlo. Okay, so anyways, so there will be a lot of talk and fleshing out about what it means to decolonize your faith. And there will be a lot of talk about how that intersects with post-colonialism. For this TED Talk, y'all, on decolonizing our faith, we had such a gift. I'm so grateful for her. Michelle Higgins rolls up in there, takes 10 minutes, and she just preaches about decolonialism in a way that I have never, ever, ever seen before. She framed it by the story of the prodigal son. And you just have to hear this. By the end of her talk, everybody was in tears. I had to close at the time. I could barely speak. I was so choked up because it gave this sense of like, you can be white and you can choose whether or not you're going to be a part of this like white supremacy, or you can choose to leave that behind and return back home. Return back home, baby, she kept saying. It was just so beautiful, and the biblical foundations of it, the way she exegeted that passage, I couldn't be prouder to be in that room at that very moment. It was so great. I recorded the talk. If she lets me, I might like release a recording of it. It was that good. So there'll be a lot of talk about decolonizing. Okay, and decolonizing our worship. Number 7, and I think this one is really, really big too. Worship will become less and less about just music. Worship will become about living. And the best person who really got on this was my best friend from Chicago, Jonathan Brooks, who wrote a book called Church Forsaken. He really brought this point home, talking about Jeremiah living into exile. And if you just spend a day with Jonathan, you will see exactly what that is, what that life of worship is, what it means to be worshiping in an uncomfortable context, and being home and making a home and worshiping God. He is a pastor on the south side of Chicago, in Inglewood, which is considered the most dangerous neighborhood of Chicago. And he really, he has created a cafe, Kusanya Cafe, which is a hit. He's on the board of the Whole Foods market that came in, and to make sure that they were really integrating themselves in the community and not trying to save the community or take over the community. He's a pastor on top of all of that. He has a family on top of all of that. And he just released an album, a mixtape, which is Christian hip hop. I mean, like, I don't even know how he has time to do this, but he's just oozing with worship to God. And I think that is just so important that we go beyond music. Tamisha Tyler and her work with just integrating more of the arts. Her friend Dia was with them as well, and just bringing poetry into it and looking at visual art. It's gonna be so rich. I'm just so excited about this. Okay, the 8th thing is that we need to hear more from. This is really, really tricky. We live in a white and black binary here in the States. There's a lot of talk about white music, Christian contemporary worship, and then you have black gospel music, and then you have like CCM gospel, you have CCM rock, you have all these different sorts of music that are there. But within that, there's such a huge range of music that we have just begun. Like, we haven't even begun really. We just barely scratched the surface. So we need to hear more from our Latinx brothers and sisters. We need to hear more from our Asian brothers and sisters. We need to hear more from indigenous voices and multiracial voices. And here is why. I think if we realize that, first of all, Asia is so big, There is not an Asian worship. That's just impossible. I'm sorry. You have South Asian, you have Northeast Asian. They're so different, okay? And it complicates the situation. It makes it complicated to put worship music in a bucket. And the more we realize that we don't exist in these like monolithic cultures, the better off we'll be. Our worship will be so much better off if we just stop engaging in that racialized practice. Number 9, we need to understand Revelation better. There are so many churches that have made Revelation 7, 8, 9, 21, and 22 a part of their vision of all nations, tribes, and tongues being in the same room together, in the presence of one another, accepting one another, hearing each other. I think this is really, it's a great vision, but my friend Adam was quick to point out that a lot of what ends up happening is that people take their own sorts of desires of multiculturalism or being cosmopolitan or worldly, and they map that, they like project that onto Revelation, when in Revelation vision we don't know what it's going to actually sound like. We may have glimpses of what it's going to look like. We don't have any idea what it's going to sound like. We don't know if they're going to be playing calypso. We don't know if they're going to be playing guitars or horns or jazz or blues. It might all sound the same. The thing is, we don't know. And so we need more of a conversation around Revelation 7. And recently I've come across a lot of things that I think really God is telling me about that, about Revelation. Revelations, y'all, it's a political resistance document. It's about resisting the Roman Empire. So we need to all be worshiping Jesus together, standing in resistance to the Roman Empire. That should immediately change how we think about Revelation. And so we just need more conversation about what that actually is and what we mean by multiculturalism. And then the 10th. At the end of our time together, we made a continuation of our timeline, and we had people fill in on sticky notes what they hoped the future would look like. And this part of the timeline was filled with so many different ideas. It was really hard to even categorize them together. We had people that were interested in creating new songs, and not only that, like new sounds, new song forms. I mean, that's crazy. So we had songwriting. We had people that were really interested in like entrepreneurial endeavors, like creating content and putting it out there, distribution stuff. We had people that were really interested in futurism and sort of talking about what do we want to see in the next 100 years? What do we want for our children's children? And like working backwards from there. We had people that wanted to write. We wanted people who wanted to think about how to care for the worship leader. And all I have to say about that is that I'm really looking forward to where all of this goes. We can no longer tokenize our worship. That's just not going to happen in the future. I put it out there, so it's got to come true. But it's going to be harder and harder to do that. It's we're going to have just so much creativity that comes out of this. And so those are the main things that I've learned. I've learned so much more. I'm going to write all of this up because I'm not a perfect speaker. But what you can do is follow along. You can follow my Facebook page if you're not already. And if you go to my website, angiekayhong.com, angiekayhong.com, you can sign up for my newsletter. I'm going to start writing a lot more about this, and I'm going to be fleshing out sort of all my ideas because I really want to serve. And I really want to answer any questions that y'all might have about this or any comments. So if you have any comments or questions The video doesn't end here with the live. You can put stuff in the comments asking me different questions. I'm happy to answer or to point you to the right answer or to have discussion about it and let me know what you would like to hear more of. These are just 10 things that I barely scratched the surface on. So please, please, please sign up. I would love to have you share this video if you can, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye.